Good afternoon to you all. I'm Dan Joseph here with Torrey Snow. Torrey, I think we both agree that one of the biggest issues that we're going to have to contend with over the next probably decades is internet freedom and how the First Amendment applies to the internet, about what internet companies are going to be able to censor, what they're going to be able to say, you know what, this information doesn't belong on our website. We've already heard some stories about this. We've already had some interference by tech companies into stories that a lot of people think should have been allowed to be broadcast, should have been allowed to be on these social media sites. The Hunter Biden story comes into mind. Well, joining us now is James Czerniawski. He is a senior policy analyst in technology innovation at Americans for Prosperity. Now, James, the first thing I want to ask you is, what exactly is House Bill 20 in Texas, and what's going on with that bill as it goes through the courts?
Yeah, it's a great question, guys. Thanks for having me on. So basically, House Bill 20 is a bill in Texas that basically tries to restrict social media companies from taking action on content on the basis of what they've called viewpoint discrimination. They want to try to force these companies into an equitable or fair applications of their terms of service when it comes to what are the rules that govern the platforms themselves. Now, that sounds nice in theory. It's very difficult in terms of execution, and it does create some kind of First Amendment concern. So we did see a lawsuit come out of this where the trade association representing many of those companies sued, and they were able to get a full injunction at the circuit level. And now ultimately where it's at now is that the Fifth overruled that, and they put out their opinion. So now it's all escalating up to where we're going to get what was projected for a while, which is the Supreme Court going and taking this up to go and see what are the First Amendment boundaries that companies can go and expect when they're operating in this space. So it's very fascinating.
Yeah, I'm getting a bit of an Inception vibe here, right? Dream within a dream, right? Where you have the First Amendment rights of the company, but then you have the First Amendment rights of the people on the platforms using the companies. And so, like, I guess, like, when you talk about viewpoint discrimination, as the law is currently designed, what is the definition of viewpoint discrimination?
Well, again, like I said, the point of this is that they do not want to go and have, like, if you have a piece of content that is violating one of the terms of service, let's say, they just don't want it to be unequally applied in terms of how that content is being targeted, right? So let's say we had two pieces of content talking about COVID, but one of them, was more targeted in terms of getting takedowns or whatever on the social media platforms. But the rule is the same regardless. It was just a matter of which kinds of posters were getting hit, right? That's viewpoint discrimination. You're saying, oh, well, this is a conservative commenter who is getting whacked, so we want to, try to discourage that in order to have more balance, which, again, sounds nice in theory. It's just problematic in execution, because what it is amounting to is a piece of must-carry legislation, and that does tend to run up against a company's First Amendment rights of freedom of association and freedom of speech and expression for how they want to go and tailor their communities accordingly, right? So that's what's at the root cause of this, is whether or not, where that line is when it comes to companies and their First Amendment rights. Now, the defendants think that they have that absolute right because the First Amendment is a constraint on what the government can go and do when it comes to your speech. And these are obviously not government property. These are private property. These are private actors. So they have the right and the discretion to go and treat their property as they see fit. So that's where you're having some of this conflict emerge, right? Because you do have, as you kind of highlighted earlier in your comments, First Amendment rights of us as Americans, as individuals, kind of butting up against the private rights that are First Amendment rights for these companies too. So it does create a little bit of a dilemma. But the First Amendment, as it's currently constructed, only deals with government restraint of speech, right? So that's really the core question here.
Isn't one of the other core questions about all of this is who gets to decide what the difference is between misinformation and censorship? I mean, I don't know. I've always sort of been skeptical about conservatives who say, oh, there's widespread discrimination against conservative ideas on social media. Yeah. And it seems to me like those social media companies are actually saying, no, the information some conservatives are putting out is bad information, and therefore we have every right to censor it. How do you balance those two things, misinformation and censorship?
Yeah, I think that it's a very fine line to walk, right? Because I think that we do want to empower internet users with having access to authoritative information, right? But we don't want to, put them in a position where they are less informed as a result of being exposed to bad information that's out there. Some of that's done by foreign actors, and that's when it's disinformation, not misinformation. But I think what we've seen increasingly is that you'll have like private actors going in and putting the screws on these companies over speech that they simply don't like under the guise of misinformation, which then can result in what people would claim as censorship. But you're not wrong in that these companies, at least empirically speaking, they're not censoring conservatives, by some wide margin or something like that. We have plenty of examples where you have like lefty magazines like Jacobin magazine, definitely not conservative by any stretch of the definition, going and having posts taken down because it violates some kind of, policy that Facebook has. And they complain about it all the time too. It's just that, it seems a little bit less prevalent there in terms of their ability to complain about it. You mentioned at the outset, like the Hunter Biden story, and that being deemed like censorship. But I would actually argue that if that was the intended censorship, then they failed miserably, right? Because
everybody knows about Hunter Biden now, right?
Exactly, right? Like, I'm willing to bet that if we look at the most clicked articles of that entire year, that Hunter Biden story was number one, no ifs, ands, or buts. Like, it got a major Streisand effect, right? So if it was censorship, it kind of defeated itself as an argument because everybody knew that information. And on the flip side, right, then it's on us as users of the internet to go and hold those companies accountable when they make that decision that we don't like, right? Facebook, Twitter. I wrote an op-ed about it shortly thereafter where I was like, guys, what are you doing? That was a boneheaded decision. Like, you should have just left it up and it would have been done in a 24-hour cycle, maybe 48-hour cycle. Instead, you blew it up into this multi-month, and now we're still talking about it 2 years later, right? So, like, this story really got a lot farther ahead than I think anyone could have possibly imagined. So I think that it really goes and highlights at least some semblance of hope that even if that's what they try to do, that it doesn't necessarily shut down all avenues of communicating that information.
I'm speaking with James Czerniawski with Americans for Prosperity. And to kind of build on that idea, I think that the concern isn't necessarily that post or content is being censored, but there is a question about who gets to determine what's authoritative. So, for example, there were several instances where Facebook may not necessarily pull down a post, but they'll put up like a fact check. Most recently, notoriously, the Babylon Bee put up a story about LeBron James and the Lakers wearing Ruth Bader Ginsburg outfits to play the game, and Facebook put up like this is misinformation or disinformation, right? So there does seem to be a sense of that the social media platforms are leveraging their autonomy to kind of advance a narrative. And so how would this legislation or this discussion influence that?
Yeah, I just think, again, it's about trying to reestablish some levels of boundaries here. And even like with the fact-checking stuff that you've mentioned or labeling, I think that, the labels and the fact checks, like, they can be held liable for anything that they personally say on those labels. Like, existing law already covers that. But with fact checks and third-party stuff, right, because that's all done through third-party people. So, like, with the Babylon Bees, and literally flag all of his content as like misleading or untrue. And for Seth's point, I know he just did an interview with Shapiro recently where he's talking about, is it really my fault that my satire is bumping up against reality, or is it the fault of reality for getting so close to satire? And it's something that's worth considering, right? And from my perspective, I'd rather err on the side of leaving things up because I have faith that as internet users, for you, me, and the 330 million of us here in America, that on average we have the capacity to kind of sort through what's not good, what's good, and be able to come to a good conclusion on our own merits. I think like the notion of misinformation gets used as a cudgel, and it's just really horrible kind of like connotation, right? It assumes that I'm too dumb to understand what information is being put in front of me, to understand the veracity of it. And I just think that it's very pedantic, and I think that we should be better than that.
So, James Czerniawski, here's what I want to know. And I know this is just a guess, but given the new majority on the Supreme Court and what they've done in the last session, how do you think they're likely to come down once this actually gets to them?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? I think that it'll be interesting to see how this goes and unfolds. I know that on the Supreme Court, we know for a fact, like Justice Thomas has certainly raised a lot of interest in wanting to have a case on this because he thinks that the courts have interpreted Section 230 a little too broadly. So we certainly know that there's at least one vote for wanting to go and probably redraw how all this works on the internet at a minimum of the court. And beyond that, it's a little unclear, right? I imagine that even your liberal justices, broadly speaking, are probably not on board, but it's not necessarily clear. I don't think that you have Kavanaugh there just based off of previous rulings that he's done in other areas, but it's kind of hard to see until we see how these sides go and argue this out at the Supreme Court. Florida just recently filed their cert petition to the Supreme Court to see if they'll take it up. So, and the plaintiffs in both cases actually support that motion, and it was all referenced to this Fifth Circuit opinion that came out recently. So what I would say is that we don't know for sure what to expect. Anything goes when you get to the Supreme Court. Like we have to see how everything gets undone, but I'm certainly very interested in seeing how this case unfolds as we look forward. It will be a very fascinating conversation that has some pretty wide-ranging implications on the internet, more broadly speaking. So a very fascinating case to look at.
And one more thing before we let you go, James. Section 230, which you actually just mentioned, that protects the internet companies from liability for things that are posted. There are a lot of conservatives, maybe not a lot, but certain outspoken conservatives who just like to get rid of it altogether, right? Donald Trump talked about getting rid of it altogether. Wouldn't that make everything worse?
Oh, you're absolutely right. It certainly would make everything worse because what Section 230 does, and it's a very simple law that gets misunderstood by everybody all the time, but all it does is it's a tort reform law. It says you are not responsible for something that somebody else has done on your platform, right? If two drunk guys get into a fight in a bar, we're not going to go and sue the bar for having two people that got into a fight there, right? That doesn't make sense. You hold the people that were responsible for causing that damage as liable. And that's all 230 does. And if we were to remove that altogether, when the goals of conservatives with this movement in general is to try to increase speech online, I'm not entirely sure that revoking 230 entirely actually gets that stated outcome, right? So I think that we actually have to have a lot more nuance in conversation here. And none of these kinds of solutions that are being put forward matter if ultimately we still have this cultural divide and this cultural rift where we just can't see each other eye to eye, or we see people as the enemy, and there's just all this heated rhetoric there, right? So I think that there are some much more fundamental issues that we have to kind of, get across before we even look at some of these legislative proposals that are out there.
Absolutely agree with you 100%. James Czerniawski, Americans for Prosperity. Thank you so much for coming on. This has really been enlightening.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
That was fascinating, Torrey. I mean, look, I mean, the guy obviously knows a lot about this kind of thing, much more than I can say I do. This is going to be a big issue coming up. There are going to be people who push back against this. There are going to be calls from some on both sides to have more ability to censor the internet. There are going to be calls from the internet companies to allow them to decide what misinformation is, what disinformation is, and what isn't. It's going to upset a lot of people. But the truth of the matter is that social media is amazing for free speech, and we shouldn't be cracking down on it. We should be making it better.
And obviously the First Amendment is being invoked in this, but I do think that we probably should start shifting away from making this a First Amendment discussion and making this more of a cultural values discussion, right? What are the values that we want to elevate as a society? And one of those discussions is going to be, should people have the right to say whatever they want without consequences? Mm-hmm. And if not, what are those constraints? What do we as a society agree is safe? What do we consider is dangerous? And there's going to be no agreement.
Who gets to be the gatekeeper
Who gets to be the gatekeeper of that information? And that's really where you're going to run into issues, because I think that there's a lot of people that would be like, oh, well, no, we could easily determine what's misinformation. But literally, the definition of misinformation entirely depends on who's asking.
Yeah, well, that's right. And that's another problem. That's another problem, is that we all sort of have our own truths, right?
Yeah.
And you can prove anything you want based on what websites you go and where you're getting that information. And I think that can be problematic. But the other thing I wonder is you talked about values, right? And free speech is both a legal issue, but it's also an American value.
Correct.
We believe in America that you should have the ability, no matter who you are, to go up there in the public square and to say what you believe and to make an argument and
without
to start that debate without general consequences. Mm-hmm. And the question, I guess, also that comes from that, and I hope that the Supreme Court ends up ruling on this eventually, is whether or not these websites, Twitter, Facebook, all these social media sites, are they the public square? Are they actually places that can be regulated by the companies? Or because of what they've become over time, do they have to abide by free speech rules and regulations as well?
It's going to be interesting because our next topic is going to center on something that was largely in this vein, but from a Republican perspective. So I was at a festival over the weekend, and I
Firefly
met
Festival?
No, it was not.
Did you see Green Day?
African Heritage Festival.
Well, that's cool too.
Yeah,
I
it was
guess.
neat. Yeah, absolutely. And so anyway, I met one of the Republican candidates. She's a socially progressive, like very progressive, but she's a Republican.
That's interesting.
And it brought up some. So I wanted to talk about this with you. I talked about it a bit yesterday, but I want to talk about, can someone be socially progressive but politically Republican? That's going to be an interesting discussion. We'll talk more when we get back. I'm Torrey Snow with Dan Joseph, WBAL News Radio 1090 and FM 101.5.